why don't you talk about the impact and the compounding effects of grazing pastures too short?
Oftentimes in overstocked pastures, you have simultaneous overgrazing and overresting or undergrazing. Here, it's almost 100% overgrazing, which means the stocking rate is way too high, especially to be this time of year and not have some feed out there. I'm almost ready to believe that they do quite a bit of spraying here because we're not seeing many woodies out there. We're not seeing a lot of weeds, so something is happening along those lines, or else the cattle are just forced to eat them because of the high stocking rate. Bare ground, which is an opportunity for what everyone wants to call weeds, opportunity for woodies, trees, and that sort of species, but also it's an opportunity for erosion and the soil temperature things that we've looked at already. It's going to be hot there. It's going to be hard for soil microbes to function well and for water infiltration to happen. From the grass being so short, depth of rooting is going to be significantly reduced. And as it's significantly reduced, the ability to pull nutrient from deeper in the soil is diminished, and to feed microbes in the soil at any depth at all is significantly reduced. So you just have a whole bunch of things happening, and as those happen, there's less total productivity. The diversity probably diminishes over time. It just gets poorer and poorer. It's just negative compounding is what's going to happen.
So we've got negative compounding effects, both in terms of productivity, soil biology, and soil health parameters, but we've also got negative compounding effects relative to the economics of this situation.
Oh, for sure. I mean, if it's going to produce less and less, you have to stock less and less cattle. Even if you're overstocked, I think you pretty soon start to figure out the cattle are either going to get darn skinny, or I'm going to have to haul more feed to them, or I'm going to have to reduce the number of cows. You have about 3 choices, all of which have dramatic economic effect. Skinny cattle are going to be less productive, less pregnancy, less weight on calves. If you haul more feed to them, you've got that expense. The economics just start adding up.
And you know, Burke, in terms of soil temperature, we measured a pasture that was well managed and rested and had plenty of forage biomass. And again, it's 84 degrees air temperature today, and that pasture was in the 70s. We measured a freshly mown hayfield, again at 84 degrees air temperature, and that temperature was 95 degrees. But then when we measure this is very, very similar to the freshly mown hayfield. This is in the mid-90s as well, 95, 96 degrees temperature on this closely grazed pasture. So it's no different than the newly mown hayfield.
It might be different even, because you've got a lot of bare ground here, completely bare ground, which you didn't have in that freshly mown field. So I'm going to guess the short grass area is going to be about the same as the freshly mown field, and the bare ground could be higher still, which further reduces microbial activity. It takes longer for it to reestablish.
Absolutely. We're in May, we're down in Alabama, so all that's going to occur now is our temperature is going to keep rising. We've had good moisture, good rainfall through the spring, but that will stop here in maybe another 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and with rising temperatures and the grazing impact that we see here, what do you anticipate will occur?
Well, growth is going to greatly reduce because soil microbial activity is going to reduce, and there's no shading. No shading of the ground, nothing to cool it at all. It just gets worse and worse.
So the basic rule of thumb is this, that if we are at 80 degrees soil temperature or under, we still are retaining close to 100% of our soil moisture, and our microbes are functioning optimally. Mm-hmm. We don't have any problem with that, and that means that our soil mineral cycle is functioning well, and that our microbes are feeding a lot of minerals to the plants. They're producing biotic glues to aggregate those soil particles. However, if our soil temperature approaches 100 degrees, and that can happen far, far too easily, then we have lost 85% of our soil moisture. And what we've also lost, though, is that our microbes are beginning to shut down. So we no longer are having that fully functioning microbial mineral cycling or production of biotic glues for soil aggregate maintenance. So now we start to see a little bit of a collapse of our soil aggregate layer. If our soil temperature hits 115 degrees, then the microbes start to break down. And they are pretty much fully shut down relative to mineral cycling and biotic glue production. So now we've got full-scale collapse in the soil, not only of that soil aggregate layer, but we also have a collapse of the mineral cycling. So our plants are not being fed, and therefore they are also shutting down.
Yeah, the thing they need the most to recover is that water, and yet we've just created less of an opportunity for that water to infiltrate. I think a lot of times we also forget that these microorganisms, a lot of them are subaquatic organisms. They need water, not just for life, but even to transport around, to move around on, to reproduce. They need those films of water in the soil to move around on. And so when we take that away, their ability to function is highly diminished, like you said, and their ability to cycle nutrients is highly diminished. And we get the compounding and cascading effects in a negative sense when we remove that, if we call it thermal cover, protecting that moisture that's in the soil. That's part of our buffer system against drought.
Absolutely.
When we have that cover out there and protect that soil moisture, that should just be part of our drought plan, part of our everyday plan to build resiliency when we get into drouthy situations like we're seeing this year in so much of the country. It provides some buffer that helps get us through.
So David, we're out here in a newly mown hayfield. Air temperature today is 84 degrees, a little bit overcast. So why don't we take a temperature of this newly mown hayfield and see what we got?
The surface temperature is showing it at 95 degrees.
95 degrees, and we're at 84 degrees here today. So even though it looks like we've got a lot of residue left here, we have opened this area up quite a bit through the activity of mowing for haying, and we can see exposed soil in a lot of places. So you temp this at 95 degrees on an 84 degree day, and even though if we look out across it, it looks like we've left plenty of residue, just from the act of mowing this for hay, we can see as we look straight down on this, actually a lot of bare exposed soil surface, and that is significantly heating that soil up. Now in contrast, just a few minutes ago, you temped the road behind us. What was the temperature on the road?
The road was at 115.
115 degrees. So we know that microbial activity on the road in the soil there would not be very good. But what about here at 95 degrees? What would we anticipate?
They're slowing down quite a bit. They're going a little deeper into that profile where it's going to be cooler as well. You know, at this time, you know, we're losing a lot more to evaporation as well. We're probably losing about 85% of the soil moisture to evaporation. And we think about these microbes in the soil, they need that moisture because they live in that subaquatic ecosystem. They move around on these water films and those aggregates. So if they don't have that, we're not going to get the nutrient cycling that we need and everything else for plants.
So what you're saying is that, you know, even though sometimes we may think that it's necessary to hay, that we still have to be careful about what we're doing because we're still opening that canopy up and we're subjecting our soil and our microbes to higher temperatures that could be damaging and prolong the recovery process.
Absolutely. You know, a lot of times I'll see a lot of producers that will, you know, try to set that sickle down as tight as they can to get as much tonnage as they can per acre. And if they just roll that back and cut it at 4 to 5 inches, you know, can help protect that soil quite a bit and maintain a lot more coolness in that soil and maintain that moisture.
So one of the simple solutions is just simply cutting your hay higher at 4 to 6 inches rather than setting it down and cutting it at 2 inches or so. And really, in terms of the quality of the hay they're putting up, they're not gaining anything in quality whatsoever by setting it as low as they can. All they're gaining is volume, because what you're doing there is you're just harvesting more lignified stalk and stem, and actually driving the overall quality of the hay or baleage that they just put up down.
Absolutely. And not only that, just on equipment wear and tear. If you're in an area where you've got some rocks and things like that, you'd be cutting off your sickle sections or knocking off your blades and having some serious issues there of repair cost.
And here we have fire ants. So if you set it down too low, you're going to be going through a lot of fire ant mounds, and that can have the same negative impacts, particularly in dedicated hay fields that are mown multiple times a year and nothing else is done there. We can see an accrual of some very detrimental effects. Why don't you tell us about what some of those negative effects are?
As we're cutting it shorter, we're cutting it 3-4 times a year. Now our roots are pretty shallow in that soil. So if we get any dry periods, we just create our own droughts. We're not building that soil aggregate there. We've already talked about how warm that soil will get with just being bare and the sun baking on it. But now we're not building any soil aggregates, we're sloughing off roots, we're selecting for the microbes that we want in there, and we're really selecting for the plant species that we want. We're gonna start seeing some issues with weeds even popping up. Fertility of the soil can start to decline as well. So now we've got a lower nutrient value in our soil that we're gonna have to apply either more fertilizer or haul more manure on. Because we lost the aggregation of our soil, we just lost the amount of water infiltration our soils will have as well. So what other alternate methods could we do?
That's a very good question. So if we have to have hay and or baleage, then we want to not hay a field any more than once a year and alternate that with grazing events. If we move away from purely dedicated hay fields, we can alternate those haying events across different fields in different years and make sure again that no field is cut more than once in any given year, and that we're always getting one or more grazing events in between cutting anything for hay. So that's really one of the best strategies that we can utilize. And that will allow us to continue to build some very positive compounding effects. And as you said, rather than losing aggregate and losing ability to infiltrate and retain water, and then increasing our reliance on external fertility and other inputs, we're actually doing quite the opposite. We are continuing to build organic matter, nutrient cycling, water infiltration and retention capacity, and those fields are continuing to function at a much higher level.
So it's all about being adaptive.
It's all about being adaptive. Yes, sir. So David, this was a cool season annual planted here, a mix, and it was harvested at basically its terminal stage. We're in mid-May, so down here in Alabama, this was going to terminate itself here pretty quickly just because of we're warming up quite a bit. It came in, harvested this for baleage, and put that up. Now, what are some strategies that we can utilize to keep this field biologically active and productive and profitable?
Yeah, so when I go back and talk about a lot of context, what are you wanting to do? Or do you need more baleage? Do you need, just more grazing acres throughout the summer, or maybe stockpile some grazing for that winter time? So we could look at planting some warm season annuals in here, whether that's some forage sorghum, some Sudan grasses, some different millets. We could add some legumes, some warm season legumes like cowpeas and mung beans. We can even add some broadleaves, some sunflowers, buckwheat, flax, phacelia. There's a whole host of different plant species that we could add into here to match up to what your context is of when do you want to graze it or when do you want to hay it again.
I agree, and since we've already hayed this, then obviously we would want to come in here and plant it into something, if we're going to plant an annual, that we're then going to graze or stockpile for winter grazing going into next winter, rather than coming back in here and doing a second haying in the same year. So that certainly is an option. Planting warm season annuals following this haying event is an option that we can take and could be a very good option. Another option is to allow this to come up in warm season perennials. We know that in this seed bank, there's quite a few warm season perennials not just grasses, but legumes and forbs that will respond. So if we wanted to go ahead and start a transition on this field towards transitioning to perennial rather than annual, we could start that at this point in time and just simply let that start to grow and respond.
You know, one of the things I'd like to do before I did that was probably take a PLFA test and a Haney test to see where my microbiology activity actually is. You know, how full is my soil with microbes in there? How diverse are my microbes? You know, looking at my CO2 respiration rate with that Haney test to see how much biological activity I'm getting in there. You know, what my carbon to nitrogen ratios are, what kind of form of nitrogen is the main form of nitrogen in there, and how much of water extractable organic carbon I have. That would really tell me if I'm ready to go into that perennial system or if I need to build it a little bit more. And you know, if you had low microbial activity and you planned in that warm season that's going to capture a lot more sunlight throughout that whole growing season, and having those different plant architecture above ground and below ground, feeding those different organisms down there, you know, that's going to be able to really expand the ability to be able to go to that perennial maybe that next year, but our soil system's going to be very, very alive.
So what you're saying is that the very best strategy, if you're trying to take fields that have been maybe in row crops prior or in annual cover crops like this field was, and then you're trying to transition it into a perennial field, one of the best ways to make sure that you have success with that transition is to, as you said, do a PLFA and a Haney test to be able to look at total microbial population and microbial activity to make sure the soil is ready first for that transition. That's a mistake that most people tend to make. They want to try to rush into a new perennial planting too rapidly before that microbial population and that soil aggregate is really prepared and ready to be able to support and promote that new perennial growth.
Absolutely.